Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast, where we answer your sales distress calls. I'm Liz Heiman, and each week I'm joined by your crew of seasoned sales experts who have navigated these waters and come out victorious. So if you're ready to turn your sales distress into sales success, you're in the right place. Let's dive into today's topic. Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast. I'm Liz Heiman, your host, and I am here with your Sales SOS podcast crew, Mike Simmons, Renee Bigelow, Chris Bowen, Bryn Tillman, and Daryl Prell. And we are here these 4 episodes really talking about compensating and motivating your sales team to do what you need and want them to do. So in this episode, we're going to be speaking specifically about the compensation piece, about how they get paid, about bonuses and commissions. And I think it's really important. I was at a conference, actually spoke at a conference in April that was a compensation conference. And the questions really were, how do we do this? How do we figure out how to compensate? And I was actually asked to speak about, once you get them compensated, what is all this other stuff you need to do to make sure they're successful? But it's a really tough question. How do you figure out what your compensation structure is going to look like? And what I will tell you is that for a lot of companies, it starts with, what can we afford to pay them? Right? Which is important, because if I'm paying my salespeople more than I can afford to pay them, and I'm not charging enough to cover that, then I don't have a business. But that's not what the formula should be. So let's talk about this. How do I figure out how I'm going to compensate my sales organization, the individuals that are doing this selling work? Mike, you want to start?
There's a handful of variables that we need to understand. The first variable is on-target earnings. So what is the earning the professional is going to receive at 100% of quota? And that works whether we're talking about customer success holding a quota, account managers holding a quota, account executives holding a quota, any role inside the organization that has a number. What's their on-target earning? Then the next thing that you want to understand is, how much leverage do you want either side to be responsible for? So in a typical account executive role, I will usually go with a 50-50, 50% base, 50% variable, that those two numbers ultimately equal their on-target earnings at 100%. So let's just say it's 100K OTE on target earnings. They have a 50K base, and then they have a 50K variable that they'll receive throughout the process, ideally, of achieving the total number that they need to hit for the year. And for simple math, let's just say $1 million. If we know those variables, total compensation, OTE, this is not fully loaded rate. That's a different thing, and you want to talk with other people around it. But OTE, compensation on target earnings, I want to know what that number is. Then I want to know how much leverage they're going to take on. If the majority of the work that they're doing is what we would typically call non-sales related activity, or things that are not necessarily going to contribute directly to generating money for the business, they might have a variable and base program where 75 to 80% of their compensation is base, and 25 to 20% might be variable. So there's different ways that you can move that around. So those are the numbers that I put in. Now, here's the thing that's really important, is on-target earnings means they hit 100%. So if you're going to add a bonus on top of it, that's not part of their on-target earning number, unless it happens to be that right when they hit the 100%, that bonus gets triggered. So if you know what your OT is, you know what your leverage is, then you can go through and work out the structure of the plan. Helpful?
Yeah. And I just want to say, though, because this is really important, 70% or somewhere between 60 and 70% of American sales professionals will not hit that full compensation package. And
it's not necessarily a reflection on the sales rep. Often that's a reflection on sales leadership creating unachievable targets, but that's an aside.
No, I don't think it is an aside. Actually, Daryl, I think it's really important. So if you set up your compensation package based on something that isn't realistic, then you're lying to your team, right?
Yeah, you have what people have referred to in the market, and I think Amy Volas is one of the people who said this probably the first time I heard it. But you have what's called a faux TE. Yeah, like so, like that's not an on target earning number. It's not a realistic on target earning number. Now, in the absence of data, you might have to make some assumptions and some guesses. And for the first couple of years that you're in a role, you're going to be off and you're going to be learning some things. So my view on that is you should heavily slant to the favor of the rep, not the business. Again, heavily slant toward the favor of the rep, not the business. You're the business owner. They're the ones who are buying into being a part of this. Heavily slant toward them and have them break the plan. If you have the data, don't put together crap plans.
So let me just hang on one second. I want to bring you both in, but let me just help with this calculation a little bit. So as you're figuring out that comp plan, you have to be realistic about what one person can actually physically do in the time frame allotted. So if your sales ratios, if your math says that it's 100 conversations to one closed deal, then you can't expect them to close 1,000 deals because that would be 100,000 conversations when I'm really being big and exaggerating on this. But you get the idea. You have to know what it takes for that salesperson to do the work to hit their numbers. And if we just pick a number and we're unrealistic about one person is able to do and what it takes to close a deal and what one person is able to physically do in that time frame, we're never going to have realistic numbers, and our salespeople are not going to be successful. So we want to be really clear about that. We don't want to stray on either direction. Brendan, were you going to say something?
So I want to talk about forecasting. I think there's something really broken in the way sales leadership forecasts and the way, even in our meetings, where are we on this deal? They push it out 30 more days. Did the IT sign off on this? No, but I have a verbal. Like there's no really clear forecasting. And I'm not sure I have the answer to it. But one of the things when I'm talking with clients all the time is I hear we're off of forecast. We're not. Go ahead.
So let me help you with this, Bryn. 60% of American sales leaders are not confident of the forecast. 60%.
Well,
that means
and I'm seeing even higher. This is the forecast. By the way, a lot of it is built off of what the board wants the CEO to perform and what the CEO now wants the CRO to perform and what the forecast is not really based in real numbers. It's based on expectation. And that's really broken because if our forecast is off, any of the KPIs, none of that works. It's all, what did you call it? Faux?
Yeah, Amy Volas, faux TE, faux OTE, faux TE. That's her thing. I
think there's faux forecasting.
Well, the job to be done of a comp plan is around behaviors, kind of like what we were talking about before. Like, what do we want to drive? What do we want to incentivize? The job to be done of a forecast is to create relative predictability inside a business so that you understand which risk you feel comfortable taking on all sides. Like how many people do we need to have inside the business and how many people do we need to let go out of the business? Where can we invest different resources? And some people will say the word risk, but don't really know what it means. And I get it. I make the inconceivable joke every time I say stuff like that, but it's kind of like the word empathy. There's people who say these things out loud, but don't really necessarily know what they mean, and then they end up getting applied in different contexts. And so I think it's really important for folks to understand when we're talking about like that forecast is, there are ways to manage that effectively that work over and over and over again, and we're getting better at it getting better at the ability to analyze data to support more accurate forecasts. As you start to move out, it's much harder to forecast. Just like forecasting the weather 90 days from today is very different than forecasting the weather tomorrow or even in the next hour. So the forecast piece and compensation piece is are separate pieces, but both equally important inside the business. And I think Liz, we've threatened to have discussions around getting into forecasting and sales process and all of that kind of stuff on one of these things. Don't remember if we've got one scheduled at some point in the future. But I think those things are really hard to combine, forecast and OT or forecast and compensation plans.
So I think let's just clarify some vocabulary here.
Yep.
So first we have our revenue goal, right? That is what the company decides we are going to try to achieve based either on a WAG, just a wild guess, or whether we're basing it on a 10% increase over last year, or whether we're basing it on some research that leads us to believe that we are going to hit that number. So that is the first thing. That's our revenue goal. The second thing is quotas. So what we tend to do, whether realistic or not, is take that revenue goal and divide it up often evenly between all the sales reps, or we use some mechanism to divide it up among the sales reps, and we call that a quota, right? So you have your revenue goal, you have the individual sales quotas. Now we have what we call a forecast. So a forecast, in some people's mind, is we have a revenue goal of $70 million. Therefore, our forecast is $70 million. That is, in fact, not what a forecast is, right? So your forecast is based upon the number of leads in the funnel, the validity of the leads in the funnel, our sales cycle, the velocity, that they float through the funnel, all of these things that are happening in the seller's environment that tells us it looks like we're not going to hit our goal this quarter. What we're actually forecasting we will hit is this, or, hey, we're going to exceed our goal. We're forecasting that we'll exceed our goal. So we want to really think about these things, because I think we mix these words all up. And a forecast should be, if we have our CRM set up properly and we know how to read it and we understand the math, even though some people say the math, you can change the math. You can't. Your math is your math. You can get better at it. But if it's 10-1, then if you only have 10 things in your funnel, you're only going to close one thing. And I don't care, what you want the forecast to say. It will show you what's actually going to happen. And one more thing about forecast. So we can forecast two different things. We can forecast what deals we think are going to close. We can also forecast our revenue on those closed deals, because for many companies, it comes in over a period of time. And that is a different kind of forecast. So just sure we're all speaking the same language. And
one more thing to add, like sometimes people will talk about revenue and what they're talking about is sales. And sometimes, so those get confused too.
What? No, finish that. What's the other? What else could you mean when you say revenue?
So I am not a CFO. I do not have a finance background. But I shouldn't even talk about the difference between revenue and sales. But revenue, I'll leave that to somebody else. Who else wants to talk about what revenue is versus sales? For me is bookings. Revenue is when it's recognized. But go ahead.
I just got schooled on that. I would say that's the easiest explanation, because I'm working with a company who is in the supply chain, and there are returns, or there are damaged goods, or there are whatever. So there's what you sold, and there's what can be invoiced, and is recognized revenue. So in some companies, those are pretty much one and the same, but in many companies, they are not.
And it's beautiful, because sales can be a leading indicator for revenue. And if you have those numbers, now you can have more predictability relative to revenue that's going to be recognized based on the success that you've had from a sales perspective. And the demand gen stuff can be a leading indicator. Pipeline created, demand gen behind that can be a leading indicator relative to sales. And you start to get these indicators that are out there, which I know we're going to get into KPIs a little bit later. But you get these indicators that start to demonstrate where the health is in the business and where the potential risk is, so that as leaders, we can make better decisions around where do we allocate time, energy, and resource.
Okay, so let's stop for a second. So we've got all this vocabulary. Hang on a second, Brent. what we really want to talk about is, if this is true, what are we compensating our salesperson on? Are we compensating them on the deal that they sold? Are we, or on the revenue, on the dollar amount? Are we compensating them on the profit, the gross profit? Are we compensating them on the net profit? And I will tell you.
So can I just quickly say, just for clarity, sales is what you sold, revenue is what you earned, right? So the question is, a salesperson is only responsible for the sale unless they sell poorly, and that's why they get chargebacks or other things. But generally, a salesperson is responsible for the sale. The operations and others are more responsible for what you keep, right? Like in a big picture. So when you build out compensation, obviously you can't pay out more than you keep, but there has to be a fairness for the sales rep, since they can only control what they can control. That's all.
Some businesses though will pay on revenue, just because that's the operating model that they use. And there are certain businesses that will do it, and there are others will pay on sales, and I mean, there's other ones that will pay on bookings. Like, I was fortunate enough to work inside an organization when you get paid up front on a 3-year contract.
Wow.
Like, that was pretty cool. It was short lived. It wasn't, it was early on and in a different place, but like there are just different, there are so many different ways. I think the key takeaway for me, or where my brain's going on this, is be super clear about what your definitions are. Make sure that you're aligned across the team around what those definitions are. And we've talked about in the past, the role reflective model. What is it? Definition. So what? Why does it matter? Now what are we going to do with the data? What are we going to do with the information? Apply that in any of these things. You'll start to figure out what makes sense for you and your business, because operating your business based on profit in one market might make sense. Operating it based on top line sales in another market might make more sense. Operating it some other way, based on activity, might make sense in another place, but I don't want to be a part of that place.
Daryl, do you have something to say? Wait. Okay, go ahead, Renee.
I was just saying what you're saying, without saying, but I'll make it a little bit more explicit, is that each of these different ways of compensation is essentially a strategic lever, right?
Right.
Like, so if you need to scale quickly, you want more sales right away. You worry about profitability later. If you are in a very thin margin company, then you're much more concerned about profitability, right? Each one of these is a strategic lever. And there are different times in the ebb and flow, even within a business, where those things change. So you may have an expansion project or new product where you are going to compensate differently than you do on your core business. And if you look at each of those things in the compensation plan for our sales as a strategic lever and how you want to use it strategically. So I think your point of defining it clearly is incredibly important, so that the salesperson is like, wait, I don't understand. I sold this. Why am I only compensated on this? Right? Like, so that is not sour grapes. That is clearly understood going in. Right. But then that you are also explaining why, right? Like, so if you have a business expansion and you are going to you're going to compensate on sales, not revenue, because we know there's a lot to be worked out, and we know that the operations side is going to be kind of messy, but we really need to see the viability of the market. So we want to get out there and do sales. Then you need to be very clear. We're testing this out. We know this is new. This is what it is right now, because you're likely going to change it at some point. And you need to be very clear, because otherwise it's going to end up in that sour grapes category again with, like, I don't understand. When I sold it for this, I used to make X. Now I make Y. I'm not going to sell it anymore. Right. So I think really thinking about it, like Mike said, defining clearly, using it as a strategic lever, and then communicating why you're using it as a strategic lever.
And
Okay,
I would
Chris.
follow up with that.
Wait, Chris, go ahead. Start.
Sorry. One quick thing is, because that plan is going to change at some point in the future, be really, really clear about why you're changing it and the elements that you're changing. Because if you leave, if they go in with this understanding that you had up front, and then it changes, maybe the business is a monumental success, and now we have to adjust something because we're doing so much better than what we thought. But that also has meant the overall business has grown. Our overall overhead has exploded and things like that we now have to take care of. Make sure you're really clear about why you're doing it and how that's going to impact those particular people. At least that's how I tend to view those things.
Okay. So
There's one thing we haven't talked about.
yeah, go ahead.
Which is, but we've talked around it. We've talked about forecasting. We've talked about revenues. We've talked about comp plans. We've talked about activities, and it's got to be rational and reasonable. Talked about closing rates, say 10-1, right? And pipeline and everything else. Here's the thing. Liz briefly talked about, kind of a top down, what's the number? And we got to work backwards. In other words, the company's sales number, revenue number we want to achieve for the year. Here's the thing you got to be careful of, guys. You're doing compensation planning. There's going to be a tendency by the investors, by the board, possibly by a founder/CEO, to blindly say, this is the number we want for next year. And it's going to be, like Mike's already laughing. It is a big ass, hairy number. All right. And the CEO, especially the founders, have zero experience doing this before. And they're going to go, okay, because they're feeling captive to these investors. They don't want the investors to leave. So they're going to say, okay. And then they're going to come back and they're going to say, but sales reps make too much money and we have a hiring freeze on because we actually want to be profitable because that's where we get our valuation up. So no more hiring additional staff. And then someone's going to go back there and say, okay, so if we want to double our revenue, because those are the stupid ass things people come up with, but we're going to have
10 times. We're going to 10 times. That's my favorite. We're going to 10 times revenue.
10 times revenue, 10x. Same amount of staff. They're just going to say, okay, so your comp plan went from being, using Mike's numbers, your OTE is still $100,000 a year, and it's still 50-50, but going back to Liz's numbers, instead of you making, 1,000 calls, we 10x'd it. Now you have to make 10,000 calls. All right. Okay, that's probably not realistic. So you did, instead of 1,000 calls, you 3,000 calls, and instead of closing 1 in 10, you'll close 1 in 3. But we'll do nothing to change the training, and there'll be no other indicators of that this is even achievable, which, by the way, leads to our last conversation, that now you're creating a culture in your organization of frustration and anger and annoyance and everything else, and they're all going to bail. In other words, you can't go top down. You got to fight that urge to appease these mystical people who are up in the heavens. You have to kind of do the forecasting thing and go, what is achievable? If this is the salaries we're going to pay, and this is the max, this is the quality of people I can attract on that, this is the activity we can do. I can maybe, if I'm really kick ass, I can maybe improve our sales success by 10 or 20% this year, maybe, if I hire Mike to come in and teach all my crew. All right. But that's it. In other words, you've got to use realistic numbers, because if you don't, there will be a shit show in your organization. You're going to miss your numbers and you're going to take years to recover. And that's where sales leadership and the executives need to bump heads in private to have that conversation. And that's your job as a sales leader.
So let's talk for a second before we wrap this up. There's a saying in the world of sales, which is salespeople do what they're compensated to do.
Yes.
Right. So if that's the case, and as Renee said, these are levers. These are levers. Compensation is a lever. If I want my sales team to sell this product as opposed to that one because this one's more profitable, I need to incent them to do it and make it easy for them to do it. If I want them to go after new business and not focus on repeat business, then I need to incent them to do that. And more importantly, we forget that if you want them to do the work to grow an existing account, which is a lot of work, people think, oh, it's an existing account, just re-sign it. If I want them to focus on that, then I need to incent them, and they will focus on what they're incented to do, unless the path to get to that compensation is so difficult that they know they're not going to get it anyway. So then they're going to sell what's easiest because at least I get something. So when we're building the comp plan, one, it needs to be simple, right? I mean, we all agree to that. That's what we were saying earlier, right? If I think I'm going to get this and then I get this and I don't understand and when does it come, you're going to have unhappy salespeople and they're going to leave. So it needs to be simple, easy to understand, easy to implement. Everybody in the company needs, from accounting to the CFO to the salesperson, to the sales lead. Everybody needs to be able to understand it. Second, it means to incent your team to do what you want them to do. If you want them to be team players, then you have to build the compensation such that they are team players. If you want them to just get revenue, regardless of what happens, what wreckage is left behind them, then compensate them that way. I think the third thing is we tend to think that, oh, that salesperson's making too much money. I'm going to change their compensation plan so they make less money. They will leave and make more money for someone else who compensates them to do it. So this idea that my salespeople make too much money only matters if you haven't built a compensation plan that covers your cost of doing business. So it's really important when we design this compensation plan that we think through the results that we want and inputs that are required to get that. Is there I think I wrapped it up, but is there anything else on that?
Here's a simple way to cover the whole my sales rep makes too much money. And it built on Liz's point. When you understand your metrics, like what your cost of sale metrics are specifically from a sales rep compensation perspective, maybe because of the way that you're operating as a business, you allocate the 14%, that's what your number ends up being. At the top end of the comp plan for the individual rep, when they break the comp plan, and they blow through their number, cap that at 14% commission with no cap on the total amount of commission. This way, when you go back in and do the math on those extra dollars that are generated, or pounds or whatever, wherever you're located, then you can go through and say, yes, they were highly compensated. This is what they contributed. And for every dollar above and beyond the 100% or whatever, wherever it is, this is what their cost of sale was relative to that. So it's just a simple way to do it. Here's the problem. Most early career sales leaders look at their CFO as an adversary. They look at them as the problem. They look at them as the person who's always questioning why the comp plan works this way and all that other kind of stuff. Stop. Look at them as an advocate. Look at them as a partner. Get an understanding of how the business operates. And then from there, go in and do your job and start designing things to align within the business parameters like Liz was talking about.
Liz, can I share a quick story about this too much compensation? One of my first jobs at a mega corporation, or probably my first job at a huge mega corporation, if I remember correctly, our corporate board in New York decided these few people at one division, right, were out making more than many executives. And they decide they want to cap compensation, right? Let me tell you what immediately happened. This company who was ranking very highly in their competitive set started falling. And worse than that, because each time they capped a salesperson who was that successful, they left. Exactly what you said, but it's worse. Not only did they leave, they went out and they didn't just take a list and go to a competitor, which I think is what these executives, as Daryl said, sitting up in the heavens or whatever, were thinking. Oh, well, they just won't go down the street to the competitor, blah, 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 whatever. No, they created their own business and became an in-between step between the competitor and their former company with those group of customers. And now they were a number one customer, ability to be a number one customer with all that buying power of their former clients and could put it wherever they wanted. Do you think they put a ton with the company that just capped them? Or do you think that they put it elsewhere in the market, right? So it was like a dual. Not only did they lose their top sellers, couldn't make that up, then they started losing out of retribution because the seller was still close to and performing well for the customers and they wanted to continue working for them. So when they put themselves in between the company and the customer, they still won. So I just have to say it because unless you experience the pain, you may not understand what we're talking about. And there is often pain. I mean, I am very comfortable going into if I work as a CMO, VP of marketing, whatever, I'm very comfortable walking around in a sales meeting and knowing there are people in there making more than me. It's not, I don't have the ego with it. So what? I took a job for whatever I took a job for. It has nothing to do with them, right? So I just had to say that because I think too many people don't think through the pain that comes with it.
I think also people forget about the risk that salespeople, that is inherent in a sales role, unless you're paid without commission, unless you're just paid. So as we're building that commission package, we have to remember that, or that compensation package, that they have to pay the bills in addition to, being able to make extra bonus or extra money. They've got to make enough to pay the bills, or they're not going to stay with you.
And all of this self-awareness you're just talking about, Liz, and Renee and everybody else, goes back to everything we just talked about in the previous episode. All right. That's the foundation. You need proof of it. Here you go.
Okay. So, hey, thanks for joining us on this episode of your Sales SOS podcast as we were talking about compensation and bonuses. Well, we didn't get into the nitty gritty of exactly how you do it. You now have some of the key indicators or key factors that will impact the way you make those decisions. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Sales SOS podcast. A huge thank you to our experts for throwing us a lifeline with their insights. We hope that episode has equipped you to navigate sales leadership with confidence. Never miss an episode. Subscribe to your Sales SOS podcast on your favorite platform. If you have questions, comments, or topics you'd like us to explore, join us live on LinkedIn every second Friday, or share your questions on LinkedIn or YouTube. Until next time, keep sailing toward your sales goal.